There is a moment in the life of every leader when they look back at the decisions of their predecessors and suddenly understand, with terrifying clarity, not what those men did, but why they had no choice. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had that moment. And when it came not in a briefing room, not in a history book, but in the middle of the most dangerous nuclear standoff the world had ever seen, 13 days in October 1962, when the fate of civilization balanced on the edge of a single, irreversible command. Kennedy had studied Harry S. Truman for years. He had questioned him, admired him, and at times quietly criticized the Truman presidency with the confidence of a younger man who had not yet been tested. But standing at the precipice of World War III, with Soviet missiles 90 miles from American shores, Kennedy began to understand something about Truman that no textbook had ever captured, that the weight of a decision that cannot be undone is unlike any weight a human being is designed to carry. This is the story of two presidents, two wars, two worlds, and the invisible thread of moral consequence that bound them across time. If this kind of deep historical storytelling moves you, the kind that reveals not just what happened, but what it cost the men who made it happen, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment below telling us something you never knew before about Kennedy, Truman, or the decisions that shaped the modern world. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Harry S. Truman became the 33rd President of the United States on April 12, 1945, a date he would later call the most terrifying day of his life. Franklin D. Roosevelt died that afternoon in Warm Springs, Georgia, and Truman, a man who had been vice president for only 82 days and who had been almost entirely excluded from Roosevelt's inner circle, suddenly inherited not just a presidency, but a world war still raging on two fronts. He was sworn in at 7:09 in the evening in the cabinet room of the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt's hand resting on his shoulder. Within hours, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson pulled him aside and for the first time whispered the words that would define his presidency. The United States had nearly completed development of an explosive of almost unbelievable destructive power. Truman had no idea the Manhattan Project even existed in its full form. He had been kept completely in the dark by Roosevelt. And now, in one of history's most brutal transitions of power, the most destructive weapon ever conceived by human beings had just become his responsibility, his burden, his choice. For 3 months, between April and July 1945, Truman navigated the final stages of the war in Europe while preparing for what military planners calculated would be a catastrophic ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, an assault that Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall estimated could cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties, with Japanese losses potentially in the millions. Japan had not surrendered despite the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. The Japanese military command, operating under a doctrine of absolute loyalty to the emperor and national honor above survival, had distributed bamboo spears to civilians and schoolchildren on the home islands and ordered them to fight to the last man, woman, and child. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa, which ended on June 22, 1945, had killed nearly 5,000 American sailors and wounded thousands more, and Okinawa was just a small island, not the Japanese mainland. Truman received reports. He read the estimates. He sat in the Oval Office night after night, studying maps and casualty projections, trying to find another way. And then, on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico near Alamogordo, the world's first nuclear device detonated in a test code named Trinity, and the sky turned a color that no human language had a word for. Truman was at the Potsdam Conference in Germany when he received word of the Trinity test. It was July 17, 1945, and he was meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to negotiate the post-war order in Europe. The news came through coded cables. The test had worked beyond all expectations. The yield was the equivalent of approximately 21,000 tons of TNT. Truman noted in his diary simply that it seemed to be the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. He told Stalin about it, without giving details, and Stalin's calm, almost indifferent reaction puzzled the Americans, though they did not yet know that Soviet intelligence had already infiltrated the Manhattan Project through a network of spies including Klaus Fuchs and Julius Rosenberg. At Potsdam, on July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued a declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. Japan's government, led by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, responded with the word mokusatsu, a term meaning roughly to treat with contempt or to ignore, a response that some historians argue may have been a diplomatic mistranslation, but whose consequences were absolute and final. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, local time in Hiroshima, Japan, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a uranium bomb code-named Little Boy from an altitude of 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, the bomb detonated at approximately 1,900 feet above the city, and the temperature at the point of detonation briefly exceeded that of the surface of the sun. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll from radiation, burns, and injuries had climbed to an estimated 90,000 to 166,000 people. Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 inhabitants, was erased from the map in a fraction of a second. Truman was aboard the USS Augusta in the Atlantic Ocean when he received the news. He told the sailors around him, "This is the greatest thing in history." Later, alone with his thoughts, the words of his diary told a very different story, a man wrestling with the enormity of what had just been done, seeking justification in the lives that he believed the bomb had saved, but never fully free from the shadow of what it had cost. Japan still did not surrender. And 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium device, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing between 40,000 and 80,000 more people. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The formal instruments of surrender were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, in the presence of General Douglas MacArthur, who accepted the surrender on behalf of the Allied powers. World War II was over. Truman was celebrated as the man who ended the war, the man who saved American lives, the man who made the impossible decision and bore the weight of history so that others would not have to bear the weight of invasion. But Truman himself never celebrated in the way the public expected. He defended the decision publicly for the rest of his life, consistently and firmly, saying that he had never lost a night's sleep over it. Yet those who were close to him, including his daughter Margaret and his longtime aide Clark Clifford, noted that the subject changed something in Truman's expression, something subtle and unspoken that no public statement could entirely conceal. He had made a decision that could not be undone. Cities had vanished. Hundreds of thousands of people were dead. And the world had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. No president who came after Truman would ever look at the nuclear briefcase, the so-called football, without feeling the shadow of August 1945 fall across the room. John F. Kennedy was 28 years old when the bombs fell on Japan. He was a Navy veteran, a war hero who had survived the sinking of PT-109 in the Solomon Islands on August 2, 1943, and he understood combat and sacrifice in a personal and visceral way that few politicians of his era could claim. He had watched Truman's presidency with a mixture of admiration and the confident skepticism of a younger generation that believed it could do better, make smarter choices, avoid the blunt and brutal instruments of the past. Kennedy was elected the 35th President of the United States on November 8, 1960, defeating Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history. He was 43 years old, the youngest man ever elected to the presidency, and he arrived in Washington with a team of intellectuals, strategists, and academics he called the best and the brightest, men like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and Dean Rusk, his Secretary of State. They believed in precision. They believed in nuance. They believed the blunt instruments of the Truman era had been replaced by something more sophisticated, more controlled, more rational. The Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 16, 1962, when National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy entered the president's bedroom at the White House at 8:45 in the morning and informed Kennedy that CIA U-2 reconnaissance photographs taken 2 days earlier had confirmed the presence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in Cuba. The missiles, if operational, could reach Washington, D.C., New York, and most of the eastern United States within minutes of launch. Kennedy called together a secret advisory group that would become known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, which included his brother Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, Secretary of Defense McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, General Maxwell Taylor, CIA Director John McCone, and others. For the first several days, these men debated in secret, weighing options that ranged from a surgical airstrike to destroy the missile sites to a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a naval blockade. Each option carried consequences that could not be fully predicted. Each one, once chosen, could not be taken back. Now, at the exact midpoint of this story, When Kennedy is staring into the abyss and the clock of history is ticking, we ask you to pause for just a moment. If you are watching this and feeling the weight of these decisions the way we intend you to feel it, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with a friend, a student, a teacher, or anyone who believes that understanding the past is the only way to protect the future. Drop a comment below and tell us, what surprised you most so far? What did you not know before? Your voice matters here. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff and one of the most aggressive voices in XCOM, argued forcefully for a massive airstrike on Cuba. LeMay had designed and executed the firebombing campaigns over Japan in 1945, and he had no patience for what he considered Kennedy's hesitation. He told the president directly, in the cabinet room, that a naval blockade was appeasement, no different from what Neville Chamberlain had done at Munich in 1938. Kennedy sat quietly, listening, his jaw tight, his pen tapping the table. But Kennedy knew something LeMay did not fully account for, that the Soviet missiles in Cuba were already armed with nuclear warheads, a fact not yet confirmed publicly at the time but increasingly suspected by American intelligence. An airstrike that failed to destroy every missile site, and military planners estimated that even a successful strike would leave some sites intact, could trigger a launch that would kill millions of Americans within 30 minutes. Kennedy looked at LeMay and the other generals pressing for military action, and for the first time he began to understand, in his bones, what Truman had faced on July 16, 1945, standing at Potsdam with the Trinity cables in his hand. The weapon existed. The enemy was real. And every option before him was terrible. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech that reached an estimated 100 million Americans. He revealed the existence of the Soviet missiles in Cuba for the first time, announced a naval quarantine. He deliberately avoided the word blockade, which under international law constituted an act of war, and demanded that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev remove the missiles immediately. Kennedy looked directly into the camera and said it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. In the days that followed, Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment continued sailing toward the quarantine line in the Atlantic. American Navy destroyers and aircraft carriers moved into position. Strategic Air Command placed its B-52 bombers on airborne alert, planes carrying nuclear weapons circling continuously in the air, ready to strike on command. The world had never been closer to nuclear war. And Kennedy, the man who had once believed that the Truman era's bluntness could be replaced by intelligence and precision, was now discovering that some crises cannot be outsmarted, they can only be survived. The most dangerous moment of the entire crisis came on October 27, 1962, a day later known among historians as Black Saturday. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Anderson and creating the first combat casualty of the crisis. Simultaneously, another American U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering a Soviet military response. And most critically, an American destroyer, the USS Beale, was dropping practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine, the B-59, which was armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. The submarine had been out of radio contact for days, could not reach Moscow, and its captain, Valentin Savitsky, believing that war had already begun, ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed and prepared for launch. Under Soviet naval protocol, launching the torpedo required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander who happened to be aboard, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. He argued, calmly and persistently, that they needed to surface and establish contact with Moscow before taking any irreversible action. The torpedo was not fired. Vasily Arkhipov, a man almost no one outside of specialist historians has ever heard of, may have saved the world on October 27, 1962. Kennedy received the news of the U-2 shootdown and the accumulating crises of Black Saturday with a composure that stunned even his closest aides. Robert Kennedy later wrote that his brother seemed to reach a place of terrible calm, not the calm of a man without fear, but the calm of a man who had finally understood that some decisions, once made, define everything that follows. Kennedy refused to retaliate automatically for the U-2 shootdown, overriding the near-unanimous recommendation of his military advisors, who insisted that an attack on an American plane demanded an immediate military response. Instead, Kennedy authorized his brother Robert to meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and offer a deal: the Soviets would publicly remove their missiles from Cuba, and the United States would privately pledge not to invade Cuba and would quietly remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession that Kennedy insisted be kept secret to prevent it from appearing as capitulation. Khrushchev accepted on October 28, 1962. The crisis ended. The world exhaled. And Kennedy, sitting alone in the Oval Office in the silence that followed, understood something about Harry Truman that he had never understood before. Truman had not dropped the atomic bomb on Japan because he was indifferent to human life. He had not made that decision because he was crude or unreflective or unaware of its moral weight. He had made it because every alternative, every other path, led through a valley of consequences that could not be fully calculated, fully controlled, or fully reversed. Kennedy had entered the presidency believing that superior intellect, superior information, and superior strategy could tame the chaos of international crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught him that there is a point in every catastrophic confrontation where intelligence reaches its limit, where strategy meets the irrational, where the other side's decisions, made by human beings with their own fears and their own pressures and their own subordinates who might disobey or miscalculate, become the variable that no amount of brilliance can fully account for. Truman had faced that same point in August 1945. He had chosen the bomb not because it was a clean solution, but because the alternative, a land invasion of Japan with casualty estimates that staggered the imagination, was the other face of the same horror. Both choices led through darkness. Truman picked one door. Kennedy, in October 1962, found a third door that Truman had not had, the door of negotiation, and he walked through it at the last possible moment, with the world watching and the clock stopped at 1 second to midnight. John Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, less than 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. He did not live to write his full reflections on what those 13 days had taught him. But the people around him, Robert Kennedy in his posthumous memoir 13 Days, published in 1969, and historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his biography A Thousand Days, recorded Kennedy's transformation. They describe a president who emerged from October 1962 fundamentally changed, quieter, more humbled, more acutely aware of how close the world had come to ending not because of malice, but because of misunderstanding, misjudgment, and the terrifying momentum of events that take on a life of their own once the first irreversible step is taken. Truman died on December 26, 1972, in Kansas City, Missouri, at the age of 88. He never publicly wavered in his defense of the decision to use the atomic bomb. But in his private letters, preserved at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, there are moments, quiet, careful, almost hidden, where the man behind the decision speaks in a voice different from the public defender, a voice that understands that the greatest burden of leadership is not making the hard decision, but living, fully and consciously, with everything it cost. Kennedy understood that burden at last. He understood it in October 1962, when the missiles were real, the submarines were armed, and the world held its breath. And if this story moved you, if it made you see these two presidents differently, if it made you think about the nature of power and the price of irreversible decisions, then please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with everyone you know who deserves to understand this history, and leave a comment below telling us what you learned today that you never knew before. These stories only reach people because you share them. And these are exactly the stories the world needs to hear.